incredible work that you and your organizations that you represent, have done over the years, decades, and for some I know it's been a lifetime of work and passion. Oh, you can't hear me, right?
No, I said centuries.
Centuries. I have to, you can't prod me like that because I'm tempted to make quips like, oh, we have turtles present, but no, we'll try to stay as serious as possible because it is a very serious topic. And we've had an initial first roundtable in a very appropriate venue, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. And I had remarks there, and my remarks here will be quite similar to those. And I'll start by saying that, we are so incredibly blessed. I walked up from the hotel to this venue, and we live in the best country on the planet. And it's something we feel innately, but the statistics, the data bears it out. In fact, here, Vancouver, every year The Economist publishes a pretty famous list of the most livable cities in the world. Vancouver is always in the top 2 or 3. In fact, every major Canadian urban center, Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, are usually in the top 10. Last year, the World Forum, and they use various matrices to measure this, said that Switzerland and Canada are the best places in the world to live. The highest quality of life are in Switzerland and Canada. And we should celebrate this. However, we should sometimes also pause and reflect. Yes, we're blessed to live in this amazing country, but things are not perfect. And there are many things that need to be addressed here in Canada, domestically. Issues of gender equality, gender violence, marginalized groups, and one just needs to look at some of the statistics to realize how much work there is. In Winnipeg, a thought came into my mind. Now I'll share it with you. One of the most beautiful things one can see is when you go into a maternity ward and you actually, some of them still have those windows, and you look through the window and you see all those little bundles of joy, the babies. But project out into the future and think of those little girls when they become young women. If things don't change in Canada, when those little baby girls become young women, they'll earn 75% of what those little baby boys will. How is that right? And what does that say about our society? How is that just? But it's not just gender equality. Canada is the most peaceful country in the world. And once again, international statistics bear it out. But once you dive into the numbers, you'll notice that there's a concentration when it comes to criminal violence. There's a concentration in the under 30 age bracket in our country. And the working assumption, if you ask the average person, the working assumption is it's young male upon young male violence. Well, that's actually wrong. It's incorrect. Young Canadian women are 1.9 times more likely to be the victims of violence than young Canadian men. what does that say about our society and culture? And what about the safety of the sanctuary of hearth and home? 70% of the victims of domestic violence are women and girls. 80% of the partner homicide victims in this country are women. And if you want to dive even deeper into some of the dark statistics, one just has to look at the numbers in our First Nations communities. Young Indigenous Canadian women are 2.7 times more likely to be victims of violence than young Canadian women, which means they're 5 times more likely. Canadian Indigenous women are 5 times more likely to be the victims of violence than young Canadian men. So clearly, there's work to be done domestically in regards to a culture of peace. And prior to beginning the formal part of this evening, there were a few questions about, how did I begin work in this area, and when did it begin? It actually started in 2005, and on a particular file, I decided to read our hate crimes legislation. And I noticed what I thought was an odd, peculiar omission. As most of you know, it's illegal to propagate violence against specific groups. And the groups are listed in the legislation. Groups based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. And I thought, well, hold on, something is missing. What about misogyny and the propagation of violence against women? So as a result, I wrote the shortest piece of Canadian legislation and legislative history in this country, a 3-letter amendment, 1-word, 3-letter amendment to our hate crimes legislation to add the legal term for gender, sex, into the legislation. Met with all the opposition parties. It was a minority poll market government. Met with the opposition parties. It seemed pretty simple, and I thought we'd get unanimous consent. We agreed to it to move the legislation at all stages, so it would become the law of the land. And we knew that the government was probably going to fall in the next month. So after negotiations, I got up in the House and began to speak. And in my preamble, I was looking at the opposition benches, and some of the women from the Conservative caucus who I discussed this with got up and left the chamber. And I had a sinking feeling. And sure enough, the legislation was shot down. I reintroduced it twice in 2 subsequent governments, and it was shot down both of those times as well. So this wasn't just an inadvertent mission. And what does that say about part of our political culture in a Canada that had experienced the trauma of École Polytechnique? So this institutionalization of an ambassador for women, peace, and security clearly should have a domestic component to the work that will be done. But as all of you have heard probably numerous times, we have a feminist international agenda. And besides just talking about it, our government did something quite incredible this year. We put $2 billion into our budget, and it's new funding towards this agenda, international. So clearly, an opportunity exists to do some very important work. Now, over the years, I've had the opportunity to travel through war zones and civil war zones. And I've seen the aftermath of conflict. I've seen how hatred is nurtured, propagated, how crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, they don't just happen. These aren't just sort of these hurricanes of hatred that just happen on their own. They're organized and planned. Humanity has, I just did it again, I did this in Winnipeg. Humanity has an incredible capacity for violence, destruction, and bloodshed. But I need to correct myself. It's not humanity. And it's probably politically inconvenient to say this, but it's correct to say it's not humanity. It's mankind. Man. I've seen firsthand, it's men that commit the horrors, and most often it's women that bear the brunt of the suffering. In 2005, in the summer, just off of the peak of the genocidal killing in Darfur, I traveled into Darfur to an internally displaced persons camp, an IDP camp called El Fasher. And there I met with women who described the horrors of that genocide, how the Janjaweed would descend on their villages, most often on camel and horseback. The villages were devoid of men because men had left a long time beforehand to fight. How the Janjaweed would massacre the old women, the children, and then round up the women, and in particular the young women. And it was gut-wrenching to listen to their stories. When I left El Fasher in a peacekeeping vehicle, I noticed outside of the perimeter, within a few hundred meters of the perimeter of the camp, and it's a vast sprawling camp, these walled compounds almost look like these red sand brick villas. And I asked the driver, what are these complexes? And he was reluctant to talk about it initially, but I kept prodding him and asking. And he finally opened up. And he said, well, that's where the peacekeeping officers keep their harems. And then he went on to explain how they would select the prettiest amongst the young women in the IDP camps for their harems. Now that happened 13, 14 years ago, but let's bring things up to date. 2 2 years ago, during this session of government, when I was still chairing the Citizenship Immigration Committee, I convened the members of Parliament on the committee and made the case to have extraordinary special hearings, emergency hearings in the summer on the Yazidi genocide, on the evolving situation in Myanmar, South Sudan, and in the Donbass region in Ukraine. The Yazidi witness that we brought to testify was a young woman by the name of Nadia Murad. Currently, she's now the UN Goodwill Ambassador for the victims of human trafficking. It was the first time, from my understanding, the first time that in a parliamentary committee hearing that was televised on CPAC, that it was necessary to give warning to the viewing public about what they were about to hear. And Nadia related her experiences as a survivor of the Yazidi genocide and as a survivor of the sexual slavery of Daesh. That evening, Nadia and I got together and we had the opportunity to speak at length. Nadia's become a friend. And I began laying the tracks, working on the relevant ministers, working with the opposition, laying the political tracks so that as a government we could do the right thing, declare this as a genocide, and more importantly to bring, and we brought 1,200 Yazidi genocide survivors, mostly women, to Canada for rehabilitation. But genocide isn't something from humanity's dark past. It's a continuing condition. I mentioned that we also heard evidence about Myanmar. All the markers were there. Crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansings, genocide don't just happen. They're pre-planned. All the flags, all the red flags were there. We heard them during those committee hearings. 2 years later, where are we at with the Rohingya in Myanmar? Millions of refugees. Hundreds of thousands in refugee camps in Bangladesh, mostly women. And amongst those women, tens of thousands of young women who have no villages to return to because they've been destroyed, burned to the ground. No family. The families have been massacred. No possessions. All they have, these tens of thousands of women, are babies. The progeny of genocide and mass rapes. You know, I was first elected in 2004, and over the years, over and over, I've gotten up. I've listened to others get up in the House to memorialize genocides of the past. And it makes me angry. solemn words are spoken, and then life goes on. So the question is, what are we willing to do about this? I mentioned that during those hearings, we also looked at South Sudan, and I've introduced a parliamentary motion, Foreign Affairs Committee, which I sit on currently, to look into that situation. But I also included the Donbass. And it was because I thought we had an opportunity to begin laying some of the groundwork for what we can do in the future. We heard in public testimony, but also privately I heard in camera testimony, some of the horrors there. The special torture squads, especially the special Chechen units that are used to torture women, girls from families that were suspected of having pro-Ukrainian allegiances, how 15-year-old girls were taken to the front lines to service Russian proxies and mercenaries, and then after a few months, once they were physically destroyed, mentally destroyed, disposed of. So we knew there's an awful culture of violence that's being created in that particular region. But I also saw an opportunity. And Canada has done something, and it almost happened inadvertently. Ukraine should be looked at as almost like an incubator, a laboratory for doing things in a very different way. It's not just about gender equality, bringing more women in to create security, but it's about creating a whole new culture. And the example is the Federal Ukrainian Police Force. Canada, with a number of allied countries, has been at the forefront of creating a new police force in Ukraine. The Federal Police Force was the least respected institution in Ukraine, considered incredibly corrupt, and people were scared of the police. After the Revolution for Dignity, they were completely disbanded. They were all fired. And Canada was involved in building from scratch a whole federal police force. Almost 30% are women. But most importantly, a very different culture was created. It's the most respected institution of governance right now in Ukraine. People actually call the police. When you see them on patrol, it's usually a man and a woman together. People aren't scared of them. They smile and talk with people. We're on to something. And just a week and a half ago, I spent a week with our Minister for International Development in Ukraine. It wasn't happen chance. It was purposeful. And we spent that amount of time. Usually ministers don't spend that amount of time in any one place. And we went to the line of contact in the Donbass. Because there's an opportunity to create a new peacekeeping, peacemaking force in Ukraine. We have tremendous goodwill in that country towards Canada. And as I mentioned earlier, after the Revolution of Dignity, there's an opportunity to build a whole new culture within an institution of peace and preparing it for the eventuality that there will be a deoccupation. And the minister and I, we traveled into what's called the gray zone. Over 250,000 people live in that zone that gets shelled almost every night. 70%, 80% of the women in the villages, people in the villages are women. At night they hide under their beds or go into their cellars. And when we talk with people coming across the line of conflict, they describe that culture of violence. There's no rule of law. It's all about power. It's the men with the guns. So there will be an opportunity to create something quite new and different. A peace force that's not drawn from armies, but it's created from the ground up. I've mentioned and spent a little time talking about that because, as I said, the time has come not only to create an institution that will send peacekeeping or peacemaking forces into different parts of the world. We need to create a whole new institution around peace. Now, Canada is the most peaceful country in the world. We also have this incredible international reputation. We have our Pearsonian peacekeeping legacy. We're the country of the Ottawa Treaty, the international ban on landmines. We're the country that developed the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect. And if any country can do it, I believe that it's our country, Canada, that can do this. So I'm looking towards all of you. We're having these roundtables across the country for your ideas on what we can do domestically, internationally, how we begin the process of building this institution, initially as an ambassadorship for women, peace, and security, but to institutionalize peace. Thank you for your attentiveness, and if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Keeping it vague deliberately.
I'm keeping it vague deliberately.
And can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. And I was speaking with one lady prior to the formal part of this evening about the process that got us here. Before I introduced this motion into the House, there was a year-long process of negotiations. One of the benefits of having been around the political block a few times is you understand how things work and happen and how things are prevented from happening. So I wanted to make sure that for a concept that most people think of being as totally out of the box, and some people immediately get their defenses up, I wanted to make sure that I had the support of the Prime Minister's office and of global affairs. It was a long process, and there were multiple versions of legislation and motion, and things were very fluid on the House. The legislative agenda changes. It's a lottery system, so you think your number's coming up. There's a certain amount of time required for legislation to go through first, second reading, committee stage, back into the House, over to the Senate. So you're constantly judging and trying to figure this out. And then at certain points, when you think you're almost there, from the political end, it goes back to the departments. So the bureaucrats can tell people all the reasons, the politicians all the reasons why it can't be. We had a real problem with defense. Clearly within CETA there was some resistance because they thought, or what used to be CETA, they thought that, oh geez, this means money's going to come out of our kitty. With defense, I think there were other types of worries. So we are keeping the security part pretty vague. I often use the example of Darfur. I'm a firm believer in peace, and I believe we can arrive. It might take us to the end of the century, but I really believe we can build the institutions that will create a world at peace by the end of the century. But we have to get to work on it. But I also know, and I've been to parts of the world where life can be very brutal, and security is important. Darfur. So I'm not a pacifist in that sense, but I believe that we can arrive at a Pacific world, and that's the ultimate goal. In Darfur, when the Prime Minister of the time was convinced to engage in a significant way, one of the things that we sent were our armored personnel carriers. I forget what they're called, grizzlies or bisons or some sort of Canadian fauna. And they had pretty high caliber guns on these armored personnel carriers. And when you looked at the statistics in the various sort of sub-regions in Darfur, wherever those APCs were, you saw the drastic drop in the death rate. Because the Janjaweed were basically, as I mentioned earlier, on camelback. Sometimes they had four-wheel drives, but most of the time camels and horses. How do you argue against APCs with high caliber machine guns when you see that it literally means thousands of lives and some of the most vulnerable lives, women and children, being saved? So we do need a security component, but our problem is we approach peacekeeping in what I think a not very thought through way. We pull people out of the military to use them as peacekeepers. I use the example of the officers in Darfur, what they were doing. But look at what our military did in Somalia. We took some of our most highly trained killers from the airborne regiment. They were our best trained military killers, and used them as peacekeepers. They're just asking for things to go wrong, and they did go wrong. So clearly, in these places in the world, we need a security component. But it has to be a very different psychological training and institutional culture. Within the military, they're trained to be killers. That's we call it defense, but it's actually a ministry of war. We need, if we send people in, we need various skill sets and people that specialize in various skill sets, but you will need security components. But those individuals, they may use some of the same military equipment, and it tends to be lighter military equipment, but their preparation and training should be in peace, not in war. But as you noted, I'm steering clear of a lot of the detailed discussion on the security component.